At what point, well, let's go back to the metformin thing, actually. So it's 1987, and you're thinking like, okay, metformin is the next line of agent we will use to treat type 2 diabetes. So metformin was already in clinical practice in Europe, is that correct?
Oh, correct. For many years.
How many years? Like 20 or 30 years?
So metformin a few years ago was 60 years. So we are talking about, 1950 or something, 1950, 1960. When I was in Israel, I prescribed metformin. That was the first line for type 2 diabetes.
What took so long for it to come to the US?
That's a terrible story that still continues. The FDA said, we don't know that metformin is going to be effective in the population in the United States. So you have to do the studies. And it was Bristol Myers really that got to do the studies. And basically they had to do a phase 3 study again to show that metformin is effective as sulfonylurea as an indication for type 2 diabetes. And if even then, the idea was that it will be good only in obese people, which happened not to matter much because all the type 2 diabetes in the United States were obese. But it was really a matter of regulation. And part of having regulation was that the FDA asked more studies to understand the mechanism of aging in metformin. And in a certain way, maybe they are right, because metformin mechanism of action is really complicated. And I'm not sure that today, as a new drug, it would be approved.
Interesting. Where do you think it would fail? In safety or efficacy?
No, it's not in mechanism.
In the inability to elucidate the mechanism.
Right. When you come to the FDA and you say, we've done that and we've done this in animal and we've done this in cells, and you're trying to show what is the major mechanism of action, you would have failed. So what I showed in humans is that metformin targets hepatic glucose production or the insulin sensitivity of the liver. And that's the major mechanism of action, unlike, for example, sulfonylurea that increase insulin secretion, right? Or TZDs that increase the insulin sensitivity in the muscle more than in the liver. So this was a mechanism that you could pack to the FDA, but it's really not the intracellular mechanism of metformin.
So at the time, was it understood what metformin's activity was on complex 1 of the mitochondria?
No, not really. This came later. I don't know what year, but it came later. It came when the seahorses assays were developed to show really which mitochondria, in which pathway of mitochondria you have changes.
Maybe for the listener, explain what a seahorse assay is.
Seahorse assay is an assay to look at mitochondrial action, whether you extract mitochondria or even tissues. It really shows some relationship between oxygen consumption in relationship to polarity, and it's very sensitive to look at some of the effects of drugs that are interfering with mitochondria action or decrease mitochondrial activity.
It's almost like the indirect calorimetry of the mitochondria.
Right. Indirect because it's a provocative test, really. So, yes.
Metformin was discovered from a plant as well, correct?
Right. It's a French lily.
And it was French lily, obviously. And this was discovered in the 40s or 50s?
Correct. The first thing that happened, there was a drug by the name of fenformin, a cousin of metformin.
Which apparently is much more potent.
It's much more potent because unlike metformin, it doesn't need a transporter to get into the cells. On the other hand, it was associated with a lot of lactic acidosis. And it was considered unsafe eventually. And then metformin was a safer part with much less of a lactic acidosis side effects.
What is the mechanism by which metformin caused lactic acidosis? Because in all the use I've seen of metformin clinically, I've never seen a case of it, which is not to say it doesn't happen. I'm sure it does. And you could stack risks by taking someone with renal insufficiency, giving them contrast and tons of metformin. But in medical school, this was like the board question you got asked every single test. what do you have to worry about with lactic acidosis? What's the putative mechanism by which that happens?
So, first of all, I would tell you that in my study in the 80s, every patient that we gave metformin had an increase in lactic acid.
From what to what in millimolar?
Within the normal range. So if it's 2 was
the cutoff.
The cutoff. So it was, between, went from 1.5 towards the 2, and sometimes even went over the 2. But it wasn't really anything associated with acidosis.
And there was no change in pH?
No anion gap, not anything like that. And it probably has to do, I don't know that I can tell you for sure, but it has to do with what happens when complex 1, part of the metabolic effect when complex 1 is inhibited. But there's lots of speculation, and I don't really care to comment on that. But I think what became clear, there is a whole, we call it, endocrinologists call it MALA. It's metformin-associated lactic acidosis. In other words, we moved away from metformin causing lactic acidosis to the association because it's, if anywhere, it described more in people that have kidney failures or have heart attacks or something and had lactic acidosis and were on metformin too. And that was kind of the association, but it's not clear to me that there are truly people who develop lactic acidosis from metformin that is just because of metformin and not associated with something else.
I'm glad to hear you say that. That's sort of generally been my bias, but I'm happy to be corrected if that bias is incorrect. But yeah, I've always thought that, frankly, so many of the drugs that we're really interested in now as we look back from an aging perspective, whether it be metformin or rapamycin, so many of the negative side effects that people typically associate with those drugs are very difficult to isolate from the patients in whom those drugs have historically been given. And so it's nice to hear that MALA is now being generally recognized as an alternative viewpoint to that. Metformin is, to me, an interesting drug from a diabetic standpoint because, and I don't know that this was appreciated in the 80s. In fact, I would suspect it was not, because there's really two macro strategies for improving type 2 diabetes. You can, obviously, the highest goal is to control glucose levels, so to regulate the degree of glucose in the blood. But you can do that through, at the highest level, 2 ways. You could increase insulin, either exogenously or through increased insulin production pharmacologically, or you could reduce glucose. And of course, metformin falls into the latter category of that, or increasing muscle insulin sensitivity to enhance glucose disposal. Today, it's generally regarded that while both strategies will have an equal benefit on the microvasculature, the glucose lowering by insulin lowering, so the less glucose production strategy, has a superior effect on the macrovasculature. And therefore, metformin would be a better alternative to, for example, a drug that's going to increase insulin production out of the pancreas. Was it appreciated at the time, meaning when you were doing this in the late 80s, how potentially beneficial this drug was?
Well, at that time in the United States, it was all about insulin resistance. People like Jerry Reven, Ralph DeFronzo, the people at the NIH, Ron Kahn, were all, discovering the insulin receptor, discovering insulin resistance, discovering the association of insulin resistance with the metabolic syndrome. So it was we all had the bias that the major problem with type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. And, we know now that it's a total collaboration. Yeah, you increase insulin resistance and the pancreas have to secrete more insulin. And we humans, at least in the condition of our environment, obesity, everything, many of us, I would say 40%, cannot deal with that. And we become diabetic. There is this Starling curve of the pancreas, like for the heart, that you increase insulin secretion and at some point you cannot increase insulin secretion, you become diabetic, and then insulin secretion decrease. And so insulin resistance was a major way, and that's why metformin was a good place to come with. At least it affects mainly the hepatic glucose production rather than the muscle. Although I have to tell you, in vitro, on muscle specimen, it's an insulin sensitizer in the muscle too.